Hi, good morning, everyone, and welcome. So I'm Arthur Demrich. I'm director of the ASU Consortium for Science, Policy, and Outcomes, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to the second in our Rethinking Science, Policy series. If you're not familiar with our work, the Consortium for Science, Policy, and Outcomes carries out policy-relevant social science research and develops methods and tools for implementation. We also teach courses in science and tech policy and organize and host presentations and discussions on a variety of issues in science, technology, and biomedical policy. And we are, above all, a convener of science policy implementers, the unsung people who manage programs that make a difference in people's lives. Since 2012, the New Tools for Science Policy series has been providing a platform for researchers, policymakers, and policy implementers to exchange knowledge and discuss new methods. This spring, we're really beginning to explore a future in which science and tech policy gets rebuilt. So today's talk and discussion is going to explore drinking water. Historically, safe water was really a remarkable breakthrough. In colonial America, it was safer to drink beer than to drink water. It may still be in some places. Municipal water systems were built starting in the mid and late 19th century, and water treatment really did more than any other government investment in the first decades of the 20th century to improve public health and extend life. And I've seen graphs that were kind of mapping out the impact of antibiotics compared to clean and safe drinking water. And it frustrates physicians to no end, but clean and safe drinking water had a much more profound impact on public health than even antibiotics, just to give a sense of scale. So today's talk is actually about the taste of water and efforts to engage communities in discussion and democratic deliberation about municipal water. So I'm really pleased to introduce Dr. Susheera Pochiraju and Professor Christy Spackman. Susheera is a principal engineer at Hazen and Sawyer, where she specializes in drinking water analysis and treatment. She earned a PhD in civil and environmental engineering from St. Louis University and a BS in biotechnology from Andhra University in India. Christy is an associate professor in ASU at the School for the Future of Innovation in Society and in the School of Arts, Media, and Engineering. Her most recent book is The Taste of Water, published at the very end of 2023, so still a quite new book. She earned a PhD from NYU and a BS from Brigham Young, but also along the way earned a culinary certificate from Kendall College, which maybe she'll tell us about in the Q&A. So please, come on up. Thank you.
Arthur, thank you so much for that generous introduction. Susheera and I are so thrilled that, one, there are people here, and two, that we get to have this conversation with you today. Briefly, who we are, as Arthur mentioned, I'm an associate professor. I only put up my one school because there wasn't space for both of them for the word salad. And as Arthur mentioned, Susheera works in drinking water and reuse, is actually part of the team that's collaborating with the city of Phoenix on their efforts to move towards implementing reuse, and is also on the American Water Works Association's Taste and Odor Committee. And we've been collaborating now for over a year. So our agenda today, we're going to give you a brief historical detour to kind of situate how it is that questions of taste and odor entered into the work of making safe drinking water in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Then we're going to discuss this obstacle around taste and odor. We're going to play a thought experiment, essentially what if, and then discuss how policymakers and others might seize this opportunity in our current deregulatory environment. Essentially, can taste and odor still be mobilized in a way to bring together communities to deliberate and plan for a safer drinking water future? So this is perhaps the biggest well-duh moment, but also the moment that I encounter on a regular basis. I love to do tastings with people when I bring them together where we have different waters and we try them. And inevitably someone says, oh, I knew, but I didn't know that water was so different. But what they don't necessarily understand is that the water we have now everywhere is actually quite uniform compared to what it used to be. And one of my favorite stories is how the city of St. Louis, around the time that they were having the World's Fair there, late 1800s, they were struggling with the fact that the water coming out of their taps was brown. That's just what people were used to. And folks in New England had tannin-colored water, so it kind of looked like a nice dark tea. And people would discuss the way their waters tasted differently. Now, if you've ever traveled to Jacksonville, Florida, where my in-laws live, you know that Florida, for example, has high sulfur-containing water, perhaps compared to where I live in Phoenix, which has delightfully salty water, if you like mineral waters. If you don't, it's salty water. Or where I grew up in northern Utah, which just has mountain spring water. And so these differences, even though they're present, they're much more uniform than they used to be. And we get there in part because of a taste and odor problem. So I'm going to pull you back, tell you a story about essentially industrial contamination in Chicago in the 1920s. And then from there, we're going to move forward to talking not about taste and odor issues caused by industrial contamination. But in 1927, the south side of Chicago found, folks who turned on their taps found the water coming out smelled really bad. Had this weird medicinal smell. It was so bad, in fact, that the newspapers reported that all of the bottled water on the south side disappeared from stores that had it. And people were complaining, and the person in charge of the public works said, hey, it's fine. We added adequate chlorine. There are no issues. Obviously, the inhabitants disagreed. And then they went on ahead, and the issue went away. Then it came back. And they decided to do a little very cold, windy boat tour of Lake Michigan to try and figure out where it was. And so we have here the map of their boat tour, where they went down from the city of Chicago down to the Lake Calumet area, where a bunch of the stillworks were happening, discovered that there had been phenol dumped into the water, and kind of tracked how the ongoing weather patterns that year had shifted what was happening. Problem went away, came back again a few years later, and they started this effort to try and figure out how to deal with it. And what was really going on was that phenol, this molecule, when combined with chlorine in the treatment, results in a Band-Aid, what we would now refer to as a Band-Aid sort of smell, plasticky smell, medicinal, or disinfectant. So you can imagine turning on your taps and getting that, and how you would feel about it. So Chicago they stole a chemist from Baltimore named Bayless, and he worked over the next decade along with his colleagues to develop an approach that would allow people to communicate about those odors they were encountering in their water. And the big thing they did, and this is just a piece from one of his articles, was figuring out what they called the threshold odor number. So the goal was to identify the point at which they, as experts, might recognize a smell, but you and I, as everyday inhabitants, wouldn't. So essentially, can we find the threshold of perception and figure out how to treat our water in such a way that that threshold of perception is no longer available to anyone except for the most trained of humans or most sensitive of humans? And they were kind of successful in this. They were able to develop this capacity to talk with each other and say, hey, I've quantitatively reduced the odors in my water using, for example, activated carbon filtration down to the level, so maybe it was at a 5, which is the highest. It's basically none of us ever want to drink that water, down to a 2 or a 3, where it's pretty hard to detect. 3 is detectable, but 2 less detectable. And this ends up, sorry, the quality of this isn't as good. In the 1980s and 1990s, this work gets further built out, in part because of the introduction of a new method of detecting chemicals, where you go from just saying, hey, there's a number that we can associate with an odor, to, hey, if I describe an odor with a word, I actually can bring it back out to specific chemicals, which means that I can use a complaint from a consumer to help drive, in a way, my approaches to treatment, which is pretty exciting. One of the chemists I interviewed said that by the time they wrapped up this research, they felt like they were able to identify up to 80% of the things in water causing taste and odor issues. That leaves, of course, a big 20%. And they plateaued. And so from then on, we end up with this interesting problem where water was essentially good enough, but maybe also not good enough. And here's where we come to the core obstacle that's present. Consumers essentially assess their tap water, and you know this. by its tastes and smells, right? The chemist can tell you until the cows come home that the water is safe. But if you don't like the way it tastes or smells, you are not going to agree with them. And so this is where we want to shift from that question of how industrial pollution led into this practice of analyzing, thinking about, identifying tastes and odors, and move, because Susheera and I are both convinced that it's industry's job to not pollute our waterways, and ideally regulators' jobs to also help ensure that doesn't happen, to think about the natural tastes and odors that are present in water and the ways in which those themselves have an impact on how effective that communities are, like how effective communities are in reaching out to their customers and identifying them. And so this is where we're going to start. We've got this problem. Folks assess tap water primarily by its sensory qualities, but making that sort of water that tastes really good actually costs a lot of money. So I'm going to turn this over to Susheera to talk to us a little bit more about the next step in this journey of identifying stuff.
Thank you so much, Christy. Am I audible? Yeah, as Christy mentioned, it's sometimes industrial spills, but sometimes, or most of the times, I would say, you would have water having naturally occurring microorganisms like algae and bacteria like actinomyces producing these taste and odor compounds. So as Christy said, in 1980s and 1990s, there was this huge emphasis on how water tastes and what are the causes. They developed some of these methods, and the interest into research kind of slowly plateaued after some time when they came up with some techniques with sensory analyses and stuff. Now, fast forward to around 2014, there were a bunch of taste and odor events happening coincidentally around the same time between 2013, 2014 in Mississippi River, Missouri watersheds, and people were freaking out because customers are calling like, hey, we know water is being treated, but why is this smelling weird? Like, where is the smell coming from? And there was a frenzy of events that happened, which led to another question, like, are we up to speed with measuring taste and odor compounds? And not just that, are we up to speed having early warning systems to detect the formation of taste and odor compounds in the water? Or can we detect blooms before they produce taste and odor events? So that led to a research project which spun a bunch of more research projects that happened within the region, which was what led me to get into taste and odor world. And I started working with St. Louis University in Missouri and American Water. They're a huge water utility company. They own and operate about 300 water and wastewater utilities on the East Coast, Midwest, and even in California. And they embarked on this taste and odor journey. They wanted to take a deep dive into what are all the compounds that we can measure with standard methods right now, which were only 5 at the time. And they wanted to see if they can revise the standard methods and provide utilities more tools to look better into these extended suite of taste and odor compounds. So that's when we started looking at about the taste and odor wheel that you saw that Christy showed a couple slides ago. And we picked different categories on the taste and odor wheel, and we picked compounds that we want to identify for the utilities depending on how commonly they occur in the water utilities. So that method finally, after 4 years, just this year, early this year, we were able to publish that, revise the standard method. AWWA has revised their standard method versions, passed it on to the utilities, and now we are helping utilities monitor these extended suite of taste and odor compounds. So great, we had these churn of events happening, spurting research and development, and we developed these compound measuring techniques, but did we solve the problem? And not really, because we can identify what these compounds are based on their physical chemical properties and why they give you that sense of taste and smell when you're ingesting them in the water, but we can't really control them. We can't really control the population dynamics in a reservoir during the lake turnaround time, every spring or every fall. We can't control algal blooms. We can't control everything that's happening naturally out there in our surface waters or sometimes even in groundwaters. So we still have these events. We still have to deal with them. We can identify better, but we have to think about treatment to make sure the customers are not losing trust in the tap water whenever they're seeing an event happen. You can tell them, hey, it's just methyl isoborneol, actinomyces does this, algae does this, no problem, it's not gonna give you any problems, it's not a public health concern. But as Christy was saying, they're not gonna be convinced, because once you start smelling something in your water, you start suspecting if the treatment is going well at the plant or not. And it does cost utilities several millions of dollars sometimes to put in activated carbon treatment, because these compounds break through really fast. So you have to change your GACs, activated carbon filters, every now and then. All the way from New York to California, we see utilities struggling with these issues and not really being able to convince the public that they have to raise their rates, because now the customer has to pay for that water. And at the same time, they're in this weird fix where the customers are not satisfied with the water quality. So there is a lack of communication, and we are trying to see the opportunity. So from obstacle to opportunity, the journey, what we are trying to explore at this point, Christy and I have been partnering on this, is looking at consumer tastings as a way to engage public early on and consistently with the water provider, and having them be a part of tasting events. And Aurora Water in Colorado did this like almost 10 years ago, when they were trying to blend two water sources from their mountain supplies and blend it with the South Platte River, which is heavily impaired from all the industrial discharges and wastewater discharges. So when they were trying to figure out the blending ratio, they invited a bunch of consumers, they had consumer tasting panels, they wanted to identify the tolerance of the community to total dissolved solids, or the salt content in the water. And once they identified where the community tolerances are, they used that to determine their blending ratios and treatment configurations. So instead of the designer or an engineer like me and trying to go to the drawing board and saying, you have to do this and this and this, we did the other way around. They asked the consumers, where is your tolerance levels, and go back to the drawing board and do the treatment. So these approaches have been very useful in terms of building that mutual trust between community and the water provider, that, oh, you care about their palate, they can trust you that you are doing something to make sure that they're satisfied with the water, they're not suspecting the treatment. And that is something we're trying to explore as a way to increase confidence in tap water itself and retain that trust and not have people go to bottled water at the drop of a hat when they smell something in the city's water system. So that brings us back to policy, and where does the policy stand at this point? And in addition to all the consumer engagement and everything we can do, can we also standardize this across using policy? And can we look at what we have now and go towards the thought experiment of what if we change these, what if we update these, or look at these a little closer? So the existing standards for any aesthetic quality are secondary MCLs, or secondary maximum contaminant limits. So EPA sets contaminant limits for every contaminant, chemical, microbiological, even aesthetic. The chemical and microbiological ones would be public health concerns, so they're enforceable. And because this is not a public health concern, it's aesthetic quality, it's secondary and non-enforceable. And currently we have secondary MCLs for color, odor. Odor is the threshold odor number that Christy explained. It takes like the number of dilutions it takes for you to not sense the smell anymore is threshold odor number, which is at 3 at this point. And there are also other, it's not pointing at it. There are also other parameters that we have secondary MCLs for, like manganese, zinc, pH, aluminum, foaming agents, TDS, copper, sulfate, etc. And these are non-enforceable at federal level, but the states can choose to override that and make them enforceable if they want to make it more regulated for their water systems. And there was a paper a few years ago that looked at looking at the secondary MCLs and saying, there's been a lot of research ever since they've been developed around like 60s and 70s. The secondary MCLs are very, very like outdated at this point for a lot of these parameters. So this review basically looked at which of these chemicals or which of these parameters are still okay at their current levels, but which of them, based on research between then and now, should be updated. Like there are some parameters such as iron and manganese and copper, and even threshold odor number that they looked at research and said, oh, we are sensing these things way below the current thresholds. A lot of people can smell these things because they're more sensitive than we thought before. And there is more feedback from consumers at this point that we can look at the data and say, we need to lower these thresholds. So that leads us into this discussion today, like we need to rethink about secondary MCOs, not only to let utilities calibrate to the growing research and this updated sensory capabilities we're observing in public, but also to retain their confidence in tap water quality, to engage them better and have that mutual trust so that tomorrow, if you want to go to your consumer and say, hey, I need to put in $1 million of treatment, they will understand why and they won't question it right away. So that's something that I wanted to share with this group today, and I think after that, I will send to Christy.
So we were curious, what does taste and odor regulation currently look like in what we would call higher regulation environments than what's going on in the US? Because we'll be honest, inviting utilities to make taste and odor issues a primary MCL would mean a massive increase in the cost of our water. And while that's potentially the ideal, that's also not at all what we think is currently possible. But we were curious, what are other people doing? So Singapore, which has a centralized regulatory model, perhaps has the best regulatory process right now paying attention to taste and odor. Their aim is that water should be free of tastes and odors that would be objectable to the majority of their consumers, although the level at which they use that threshold odor number is 3. So many of us who are more sensitive might not actually agree. But this is something that could be determined through, for example, the community outreach sorts of work that Susheera has mentioned. And Japan, similarly, like Singapore, has a centralized regulatory model, but it's somewhere between Singapore and the US, where it is locally enforced as opposed to enforced at a central level. And their aim is water that does not have any abnormal taste or odor, provided, however, that taste or odor arising from disinfection is excluded. So there's, of course, in a regulatory environment, the opportunity to call for policy changes that might include more national level regulation around taste and odor things. As Susheera was pointing out, many of the current secondary levels are set in such a way that pretty much the entire population can detect what's going on. So we think that perhaps in a different regulatory environment is something that would be worth looking at. But no matter what, we think we should move taste and odor from the trunk to the passenger seat in the car that is driving stuff. Because currently these issues are more or less in the trunk of how water utilities are thinking about things because of the cost and because of the regulatory aspects. And so we've wondered, what might this look like in a deregulatory environment? And our biggest goal here in trying to come up with ideas is how can you create carrots rather than sticks that might pull people into, and by pull people, I'm going to say pull states, pull municipalities into this process of saying, wait, this is something we can do and something we want to do. And the reason we think this is a goal worth pursuing is because its outcome is increased trust, especially at a time when trust in government seems to have rock bottoms. I hope. I hope we're going up from now. But this is a way to build trust and understanding between the folks who are paying for the water and thus paying for the long-term infrastructure, and something that both Susheera and I think is incredibly important, which is the fact that municipal water done well means that there's this equitable access to safe drinking water that also is not scary drinking water. So again, we recognize that just because it tastes good, it doesn't mean it's safe. But done within our current regulatory system, it can be safe and it can also taste good. So building this trust, one way that could do this is we are curious, what would it look like potentially to have a national level, e.g. a presidential award, or state level awards around things like not just customer satisfaction or overall quality, and overall quality you can think best tasting water ever, but also something like most aesthetic improvement. So this possibility of inviting utilities to work towards demonstrating their most improved game, right? And maybe this is hopeful, but I'm going to go for it. What might this look like on a policy side? Obviously, there are questions about where's the money going to come from. Could there be appropriations for outreach training to help either state level groups or national level groups train utilities what it could look like to do this sort of outreach with their consumers? Because it's kind of scary to sit down and offer someone the thing you made and have them tell you, I hate it. So how can you frame this so it's not an I hate it, but rather I'm curious about what might we do about this? And specifically, help training or provide, ideally, some funding to facilitate community events. And the reality is here that the utilities are already going out to community events. They're often tabling, they're offering educational materials about what they do, but they're not necessarily tasting and not necessarily inviting the inhabitants in the region to try the water and then have a conversation with them. And we think that this is actually perhaps one of the easiest, lowest hurdles to get started with to make a change with this. So with this, we're going to say thank you. If you want to know more, there's a forthcoming field guide from the American Water Works Association. This is the older one. If you want more of the history, as Arthur mentioned, I wrote a book. It's in the ASU library. Here are all of our references. We're very grateful to generative AI for making that image of the car schematic, and to all these other folks for writing awesome stuff. So thank you. Questions?
Thank you, thank you. So I'm going to run around with the mic, but I'm also going to kind of use chair's privilege and ask a first question, which is, so on those consumer panels, when people are doing water tastings, you know, there's different forms of community engagement around programs like that. So one is, you know, do people like it or dislike it? It's kind of a straight taste test, or the corporations do this, right? You bring a group in and you watch through a one-way mirror. And I'm always intrigued by moments when people refuse to answer the question as phrased and instead take it to a different direction. So there's this really famous one in environmental policy where they convened community groups and asked them what degree of air pollution they would allow for in the Grand Canyon related to like a proposed power plant. And the answer was none, meaning people priced clean air in the Grand Canyon and National Park at infinity. And so it kind of blew up kind of cost-benefit ratio, the way economists want to do. So I'm just curious, like, did people in these panels, if you were able to observe any of them, give different feedback than on the taste of water? Did they raise some other questions? Did they start asking about lead pipes? Did they kind of take it in a different direction at all? And was the municipal water company in any way ready to handle going in a different direction?
I can speak to this from the Scottsdale region. Can you speak to it from Colorado? Okay. So obviously in my ideal world, we move beyond I like it and I don't like it into why does my water taste musty or corky? The reality that I've encountered in the public engagement work I'm doing is people are always going to tell me if they like it or dislike it. So that's the first thing. The second thing is there are people who will refuse to taste the water. So that's in a way not dissimilar from your zero game. But what we've encountered in our public engagement work is people actually are really curious and they like being brought on as experts. And I think the fact that you are creating this moment of curiosity and vulnerability between the utility and what I call, it's a leveling of expertise. So we're all everyday experts around our water. Everyone turns the tap on multiple times a day, and even though you're not paying attention to it, you are sniffing that water and you're paying attention on this very subliminal level to, is this normal? Because the second it's not, you will notice. You will, if depending on who you are, you will also probably call your utility. And this depends, of course, on how bad it is. And in a world where things are functioning appropriately, your utility responds. I want to acknowledge cases like Flint, Michigan demonstrate that sometimes stuff happens where the utility doesn't respond adequately. And that's often related to larger issues of what's going on your state level. So in many ways, this is really a question of effective governance. So the short version is yes, people will come up with something else. people will opt out completely of participating, but at the same time, there is a large number of folks who want their expertise to be heard and who want to understand what is going on and why their water is the quality it is, and are going to have conversations with you. We're really curious as places like Phoenix move towards bringing potable reuse. So this is direct water recycling, where you take wastewater, clean it up, stick it right back into the drinking water supply, and blend it. We think there's a really pressing opportunity here in cases where utilities are bringing on potable reuse to make certain they're partnering with their community to say, what is the level of saltiness you're willing to accept in your water?
Yeah, no, I think you covered a lot of ground that I was thinking, but I'll just, add on a couple things. Like, there are always two types of people who say, I'm more sensitive, that's why I'm feeling this metallic taste or something in the water, but don't mind, I'm just a sensitive nose. But there are others who say, no matter how good it might feel or taste, I still am like skeptical. So that's like the spectrum ends, and people I've seen like fall into that spectrum at several places. And yes, I agree. There are people who are very enthusiastic about it. No matter how it tastes, they can trust it. And there are some people who, and it's very subjective, right? Like, what you smell is not what I smell from the water. Somebody can be more sensitive to a specific taste. Somebody can be more sensitive to the salt. It's very, very subjective. So there are consumers who understand it and who describe it but take it for what it is. And there are some who have these alarm bells going off the moment they feel something odd. And for a long time, at least in Colorado communities, when we do these water taste tests locally, we've seen sort of the acceptance from the community. My water doesn't taste that great. Like, they know compared to the other community, because they're all different water systems within the same city. So you know that, oh, the city of Denver water is actually better than what my county is providing. But there is a sense of acceptance because that's what they've been drinking for a while. So they're like calibrated. Reuse is actually bringing in questions again and making everybody question the water again. Like, oh, like, this is a different question now. This is not a matter of me just accepting my source water up until now with its natural sources and whatever is happening. But now they're talking about reusing these water supplies and bringing in this treated wastewater. And now there's enhanced focus on that, which rightly so. Like, they deserve to know how it's being treated and what the water provider is going to do to take care of that. But now what happens, and I've seen this in some tasting events with reused water specifically versus general tasting event with conventional water, they have a very heightened sense all of a sudden, and they want to actually find something. It's the perception that leads the person to be more curious and like, oh, I want to figure out if I can smell something different, like, because it's reused water, it's like poop water or toilet to tap. Like, you hear all these things from media and they're like suddenly so aware now. So that is something I felt was very interesting to see, how that perception changes the judgment a lot by a lot of means. I don't know, do you agree with that in Arizona?
Yes. I know I saw some other questions, but I'm going to add one more thing. My collaborators and I did what we call our popsicle project. I can speak, Otter Pops, so advanced water treatment pops, where we worked with a group of tap water hesitant consumers, also known as people who don't drink their tap water. We took them to Scottsdale Water. They got to try the reuse water. They had a 2-hour education adventure in learning all about what was going on. And then we brought them back a year later. And all of them were essentially from the city of Phoenix. And we said, Phoenix is moving forward with this. We want to know, what are your questions? What are your anticipations? What might be some hopes and what might be some concerns? And because I do culinary stuff, I then had them associate each one of those things with a flavor. And then we worked with local popsicle makers and with Scottsdale Water to make edible stories about what they anticipated this future with potable reuse water might be like. And what really struck me, and here's where I can't tell how much of, the idea that the researcher can influence the outcomes versus the folks bring their own things. But they were really curious, not about, is it safe? A year on, they were more or less, it's safe for now, but will it be safe in 5 years? So that to me is a question of, what are you going to do to make certain the filters continue to stay clean? How are you going to monitor it? What's going to happen to our environment? Are you going to steal all the water from the Salt River that already doesn't have a bunch? We want to not see that happen. Who's going to get access to this? For the vast majority of them, they recognize this reuse water is really high quality water, which is accurate, but also in part because it tastes so much like bottled water, which I think is a concern. The bottled water has come to be the flavor writ large that people say that's good water. And then the last thing was essentially, when am I getting it? So these to me are really interesting questions, and ones that I think utilities can easily answer and should be engaging with the community about.
Well, thank you both for this this presentation. This is really interesting. You kind of touched on my question at the end of your last comment there, but I was going to ask if you have a sense of how people come to have an idea of what water should taste like. Is it purely just what they're used to growing up? Is it from the marketing of bottled water? Is it from some other thing? And then I guess related to that, how much are these compounds that you're measuring in the water, are those universally perceived as bad across geographies and cultures and so forth? So, yeah.
Okay. So as far as the taste of water, when I do tastings with people, which, by the way, you should do this with your family. It's really fun. Collect water from a few different municipalities. If you want, buy some like super salty mineral water to add into it, since I didn't bring you water from Phoenix, or just come visit. People often, not often, they always bring childhood experiences with them to it. So for folks who participated in the tastings we did at Scottsdale's Canal Convergence, for some people, if the water tasted like hose water, that's all they wanted. And they're like, I know that water can't be good for me, but that is the taste of a happy summer day, like outside. Or some people pointed to, oh, I'm smelling chlorine, and I don't necessarily love that, but that's also the taste of a happy summer day. And when I did a tasting last week in Toronto, one of the participants said, well, this water to me has a slightly metallic tinge to it. And that's childhood, because he'd grown up drinking out of metal cups. And so we do all bring some sort of background and experience. And if you have happy memories associated with a taste, that taste can often be perceived as positive, as in the case of a hose, even if you intellectually recognize that maybe you don't actually want whatever compounds are in your hose leaking into your water. So there, we start from a really varied place, and I think that's a really exciting thing, because it's an opportunity for people to talk to each other.
Yeah, and for the compounds being universally perceived, yes, the answer is there is, within the population, if you look at it, the sensitivities may vary depending on how sensitive your nose is or your tongue is to these things. But if you almost like take an average of people who are this highly sensitive to like moderately sensitive, that tallies out pretty much with every community across, because the odor thresholds that we see are very similar in different countries, from US to EU to Australia to Japan to Singapore, because there is always that population pool among a given community that can sense things at those levels. And we are talking about PPTs, like nanograms per liter levels for these compounds. So we're very sensitive. And by evolution, I think we're sensitive, because when we are eating fruit from like a tree or something and it has some kind of contamination, we're supposed to detect that. We're supposed to detect something funky in it. So we are evolutionarily driven, which is why a lot of organoleptic studies that looked at populations come to that similar conclusions that, oh, every population will have this sensitive bunch of people that are gonna detect things like at very nanogram per liter, low nanogram per liter levels. So that is universal, and the way providers respond is also universal. Like you can see utilities like Scottish Water or British Water, they do these tastings with, they employ people, literally experts in their laboratories, who are doing these tastings every week and making sure that before it reaches the customer, this trained experts will determine if there is any off flavor or something and tell the provider, we need to look at the treatment. So it's that, just like same thing with the Singapore and Japan's philosophy of water shouldn't have any off-putting tastes or flavors. It should feel clean. It should not have any nuisance odors in it. It should feel like bottled water. I hate that we have come to that place, but it should feel clean is universal across, if that answers your question.
Yeah, Christy, so I'm so glad that you finally came and did this talk, because we've been working on it for a while. Because the outside context also, I think, has changed in the interim time. So I'm trying to play the science policy piece of it, which is when you said from the trunk to the passenger seat, right? And I'm thinking about, normally, and you mentioned about engagement, right? Usually we think of engagement as coming after we have done the science piece, right? So I'm going to argue for the opposite. And the way I would do is that, so because we thought of these as more of cultural issues. So when, so I'm originally from Bangladesh, and when they removed the arsenic from the water, there was a chemist here in George Mason who won the prize. But people didn't like to cook with that water because it turned the rice some different color than what they're used to. And we kind of thought of it as cultural, right? Okay, and then you have to figure out why. And then you fast forward, and the BP thing happened when I was here, and then everybody was trying to assure that it's fine scientifically, chemically, but people were saying the smell. What you do about the smell in New Orleans and so forth. And then you had Flint, which was an actual problem, right? So in gene editing, for instance, the National Academy came out and said that, public engagement cannot be an afterthought, right? So here, judging from where things are going, from a science policy point of view, it actually gives you an early indicator of a problem that you haven't even figured out. So is there a way we do engagement here? It should actually come at the very beginning, like you were saying in Singapore and other places, that it's actually part of it, not thing as an outreach kind of thing.
This is such an interesting question, in part because science policy around water safety was made essentially a century ago. It's still being made, but it was made in many ways a century ago. And I think potable reuse offers an opportunity for a flip, and yet at the same time, that itself, the train, as far as I can tell, is out of the station. Potable reuse is happening, even if there are alternatives to it. So what might it look like to have questions of taste and odor still become, not sit in the trunk, but actually enter the passenger side? I'm going to imagine we have a world where utilities and regulators actually are really excited about working together, as opposed to the reality of the tensions that are there. And in that world, I can see regulators talking to utilities and saying, we need you to assemble a consumer advisory board. So you're going to train them, and then they are going to be part of your network. And maybe every year you're going to give them a small stipend. It could be volunteer paid. And there are cities that already do this. They do have people who are part of a group. Scottsdale has, I don't remember if they call them their water warriors or water ambassadors, but it's a group, citizens, water, I don't remember. But basically, they have trained them to, one, they have education about what is going on, so that we could say falls into the public deficit model. But they also have participated in tastings and have been trained to have some sort of connoisseurship. And they thus are acting as part of this early detection warning system to send a feedback loop. Now, I know none of us actually are really excited about the idea of being an early warning system and using our bodies that way. Yet at the same time, especially with the question of these naturally occurring tastes and odors, I think it's a really interesting way to say, if we as a community value having water that doesn't taste a little bit like the land it came from, then we're going to reach out to people, work with them to make this, and we're also going to choose to invest accordingly. On the flip side, I think there's an opportunity to teach people using the wine idea of terroir, that your water actually should taste of something. And you would be starting young with kids and introducing them to the different tastes that are naturally present in waters, helping them understand what they reflect in the environment, and maybe even having like searching opportunities where you go out and you report back, oh, hey, I actually tasted the change of seasons. I don't filter my water 11 of the 12 months that I live in Phoenix. But when the season changes and the turnover starts happening in fall and the geosmin levels spike, I actually do use a Brita for a hot second because it reaches a point where I am like, I know this and I understand it, and I'm going to opt into this other system. And that leads us to another interesting question, and I don't know how to navigate this, which is we have an entire infrastructure of goods that are already out there that have helped shift the flavor preferences. So think about your refrigerators. Any one of you who has a fridge where you can get water from your fridge, there's a filter built in already. Which means that the majority of people in the United States who have purchased a fridge recently already are bought into a filtration system and have already bought into the idea that your drinking water should taste a different way. And I don't know that we can undo that, but we could certainly start a conversation.
So I was thinking a lot about these sort of post-delivery modifications that folks do. So is that in some ways, you know, that industry creating a market by telling people that it's better like this, even though there isn't necessarily like additives to make soap antibiotic, even though soap's not, you know, is this just a marketing ploy? Or does it, in some cases, I assume it does solve a real problem?
I'm going to flip that on you. So tell me about your appliances and the buildup they had in Tempe versus the buildup they have in Maryland when you moved. Are you noticing a difference with your water faucet?
It is 180 degrees, right? So, of course, Phoenix, obviously, you have to clean your shower head every week because of the crusty buildup.
Yep.
But in Maryland, I'm not on municipal water either, so I have a well.
Okay.
And so I have to do my own post-pump treatment system. And it's amazing because I can't tell, but my wife and daughters can tell instantly when the salt in the water softener is gone because they can sense iron very, very quickly. But after that, we don't do any, there's a filter and then a softener and then that's it. But it's very, very soft water. Like, be prepared to really work that shampoo out of your hair because it's going to be there for a while.
So I think what you're highlighting here, and I picked on Ira because I knew Ira had made this move, is this much larger question of how we also use our senses in a way to decide which systems we're going to opt into. Culligan did a really good job. I haven't tracked exactly when they started, but at least it's 1960s onwards, advertising the idea that the buildup in your pipes was something to be scared of. Which is fascinating because most of that buildup is caused by calcium. And I don't know about all y'all, but every time I have seen an advertisement for a glass of milk, it's also been pointing out how it's going to give me strong bones. No one has said to me, your municipal water, however, is going to give you strong bones. But they could be saying that because of, you know, there are these minerals present in the water. And we do know scientifically that when you strip them out through a reverse osmosis system, if you don't add those minerals back in, you're going to have problems down the road, especially if you're not supplementing in some other way. And so I've lost your question in my talking.
I don't really know that I had a question, but, you know, it felt like there was a, let me go in a completely different direction since we're in an interesting policy environment now. Utah recently banned fluoride in water.
I've noticed.
Is this a trend based on this water needs to be of some purity? Do we anticipate this moving along? I mean, there's the conspiratorial aspects of it, but is there also a purity aspect here?
Can you answer this one?
Yeah, I would say
just
so.
thoughts.
It is a lot about the purity, but also behind them judging what pure is also the taste. Like they feel like, oh, when it tastes this, I'll call it plasticky because that's how bottled water feels like to me. And somehow they come to that perception that if it tastes clean and that's how it's pure and they shouldn't feel anything in it. So it is driven by purity, and obviously the conspiratorial aspects don't help because they see these things blown out of proportions and say, oh, this is why it's smelling funky, because they're putting in industrial fluoride up there, which isn't true. It's the utility that purchases the chemical, very pure in its pure form, and adds at a very safe level, but that gets lost in all the information, misinformation stuff. And yes, it is very much driven by that sense of purity, and I think going back and tying it to your previous question, I do think there is a marketing opportunity to show, based on science and data, that we are detecting microplastics now in bottled water. We're detecting other compounds that we can typically remove at the water treatment utility. Plus, they're not even regulated by EPA. All the MCLs we are talking about, they don't even apply for drinking water, for bottled water, because it's under FDA approval. So that part, I think, gets lost in the communication aspect, and utilities only realize that they need to do better outreach and market the water once the PFAS issue started, and how everybody just looked at utilities with a huge lens that you are the problem. And the utilities had to buckle up and say, no, we need to get better in communicating to our public that we are not the problem, we're trying to solve it. And this is what we have done. We are at a safe level. This water is pure. This water is safe. So there's a focus, there's a shift in focus on marketing piece, but only to save the nightmare around PFAS. But I believe, to your point, we should take that further, 2 steps further, and use it as a marketing opportunity. Because it's, at the end of the day, a beverage that a consumer is taking from the tap, and they treat it as a beverage. They compare that with other beverages. They judge that like a beverage. So they are a customer, like companies do feedback from a customer. Utilities can do that too and market it better. So I don't know if that answers the question or raises more questions.
Only beverage we wash our clothes with.
Right.
Can I add one more thing? I actually am curious. Utahns, I grew up there, so I'm going to speak for my folk. Utahns love their nutritional supplements. I'm so fascinated from that side how fluoride as a nutritional supplement has been pulled out, and I haven't studied this yet, but perhaps you just gave me a new research project, Ira.
So Mahmood asked a great question. I'm going to jump in. Well, go ahead, Bob. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to ask, what's the policy context? Susheera, I think you mentioned that the company you work with works with 300 utilities or something like that.
Right.
How many local utilities are there, and what's the role of local, state, and federal? What's that look like? How do you change policy?
It's a good question. So I'm trying to understand, like, are you asking how many local utilities are like interested in looking at the policy? No, just how many? Oh, yeah. Thousands of public water systems. And depending on the size, we're looking at big systems that are in the hundreds. And if we are looking at smaller systems serving like 5,000 people, 10,000 people, like thousands is what we're looking at. And it's not very easy to bring them all on board, even on public health concerns. Even for things that matter, it's hard to convince a community to increase rates or to rethink the policy or rethink how the water is being delivered and received. So not at all easy. With American Water, that company, it was easier because it was a centralized system. They had a laboratory for compliance, a laboratory for R&D. There were people sitting and looking at all the treatment systems and talking to these people. But that is because it's a private, publicly traded, but private water company, which is not the case for most municipalities in the US. They're run by the state governments and local governments. And city council is where the stopgap is. Like you always have to go through the city council to get any kind of permission to change things, and then get to the state regulator. You first get the buy-in of the city. And back home in Colorado, we had we had a community that they were very sure that they needed a new treatment plant, but they were also doing some conservation so that they don't have to build a huge treatment plant and have a smaller plant and help consumers conserve water. So they started metering their lawn uses and everything, which was fine until a while. And there was this one angry customer who had a huge lawn. They did not like the city is trying to raise rates and meter the lawn water usage. They ran for the city council. They dismantled the whole project. The consultant involved, the engineers involved, the city involved, everyone had to take a step back because they won the election. And they said, not in my backyard. That sign came up on the yard and said, not in my backyard. You can't bill me for my lawn usage. So it only takes sometimes like a few angry customers to go and convince the city council to step back, and your whole project is doomed now. So it's, yeah, I hope it answers the question of the difficulty in getting people up to speed. And then even with, yeah, if it's that hard with public health, like PFAS, I personally assume it's gonna be really hard to convince them for something that's not a huge public health concern, but an aesthetic thing.
So Mahmood asked about sort of public engagement opportunities there. I want to ask another policy-oriented question, which is around risk and kind of centralized versus decentralized. So I live in Silver Spring. The water comes from the Potomac River, is treated, is sent through pipes of presumably, cast iron or maybe newer PVC to my house. I don't actually know what's between my house and the street. That could be lead, it could be cast iron. In my house, I have some PVC piping, some copper piping, and some late 20s, early 30s, it's like a chrome alloy that collects deposits on the inside that Christy pointed to earlier aren't in any way harmful to you. It's mostly calcium and other minerals in the water that mineralize, but slowly those pipes kind of get choked off on the inside. So given, and that's typical, right? People have some idea, not fully what's in their house, and between their house and the street has been told to them is your responsibility and your fee, and it might be lead, it might not be. So given those uncertainties, what's your take on kind of the consumer pull for filtration, right? So, it's tempting to blame the refrigerator company for building this in, and yet it's pretty clear consumers also have some say in this. So when you think about like municipal water companies marketing their water, just how would you build in some assurances around what's actually going on in the part of the water sequence that the municipal water supply has no control over, right? From an engineering viewpoint, they see it where it leaves their plant. They're not seeing it out of the tap.
I mean, they are seeing it out of a tap when you call to complain. So some utilities have dealt with this by offering free lead testing kits, lead testing kits that your taxpayer dollars paid for as a way of saying, we want you to know what's going on here, but not everyone has chosen to do that. And so you're highlighting a much bigger question. This is the only consumer product I know of that I've been able to identify in my years of thinking about and poking at this problem that is piped into your house. All the other consumer products, the companies have complete control over the packaging system. This is the only one where they don't, which raises, it is a naughty problem, and it is not N-A-U-G-H-T-Y, but we could also think of it that way, rather K-N-O-T-T-Y. Because of the fact that there certainly is a way that you could deal with this, which is you start from now and going forward, you build into your building code purple pipe, for example. So you start saying water for use, and you can start building forward, and then every time a home gets remodeled, they have to remodel to that specification. I think that's one of the most exciting moves I've seen on the part of cities, is when they look forward and they say, we need to be able to build a new system, but we can't actually afford to tax our communities into it. So what we're going to do is we're just going to change the code and build towards the future we want to be. And I think that's the only way I know of so far that you could, from a policy perspective, not instantly solve the problem, but build towards that problem. Otherwise, it's still just Band-Aids.
So you touched on this, which was, and I'm trying to do this very delicate walk right now in the political environment that we're in, is the trust piece of this, right? Because there is a legitimate case to be made that by leading with the science, we have kind of insulated the science in a way that people don't trust the institutions that tell them what to do and what not to do. But as the politics of this now shifts from federal to local and state, so is there an opportunity actually here on the trust angle to rebuild the confidence one municipality at a time using something that is very relatable to the public?
I think the answer to that is an emphatic yes. Totally biased though, because you're bringing people in again on their level of expertise, which is saying to everyone, you have a body, your body smells things and tastes things. We recognize when you have a cold, not so much, or as you get older, but when you have a migraine, you're really good at it. We want you to be part of this. And that then results in conversations where you meet the people who are making your food. And since I'm trained in food studies, I'm really into the idea that knowing who produces your food creates levels of trust, and it also creates relationships of responsibility. Because it then also means that the person who produces your food can say to you, I need your help. I need you to co-work with me in making this product better. Not everyone's going to agree. Someone's going to still want to water their lawn and not be metered, but a lot of people will agree.
All right, wonderful, wonderful. So three quick things in closing. First off, please hang out, have another cup of coffee, and speak informally with our two speakers. Second, our next program in this series will be on Thursday, April 24th, featuring Emma Froh and Dalton George discussing biocontainment and deliberate release of genetically modified organisms. And finally, please join me in thanking our speakers. Do not thank me.